Hello, I'm Morag, and welcome to this special episode of Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, a conversation from the 2024 International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. In this festival, I invited my friends and colleagues to join me in conversation, ideas sharing, music, film screening, poetry reading, and storytelling. I was joined by educators, Indigenous leaders, designers, artists, scientists, activists, scholars, practitioners, philosophers, writers, filmmakers, and musicians, exploring ways to broaden and deepen permaculture possibilities. There were 35 speakers at the live event across 8 days in May 2024, spanning 6 continents and over 2,500 registered people for these live events. What an extraordinary event, and I'm so honoured, delighted to be able to share these with you. Before we head to the conversation, I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm recording this episode from my hand-built, solar-powered studio here in beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country with Jinnaburra lands to the east. I'm surrounded here by my permaculture forage gardens in a permaculture eco-village. This podcast is a project of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, teaching, and livelihood skills online to people on 6 continents, who in turn localise and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share wherever they are. Check the links below to find out more about our programs. And remember too to subscribe to Sense Making the Changing World on your favourite podcast app, to share it freely, and to leave us, please, a 5-star review and a lovely comment, because it really does indeed help people to find this podcast. So I'd like to welcome Lyla June Johnston here today. Lyla, I saw speaking at Planet Local for the first time, which is a summit in Bristol last year. And I have to say, I was just saying to Lyla earlier that something about how she opened the space in that room shook the energy in the room and transformed how people perceived what they were there for, what they were doing, and what the different perspectives on ways of knowing were. So I really would love to welcome you here today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Greetings, my relatives and my people. I'm from the Non-Extractivist clan of the Diné Nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo. We are indigenous to what is now called New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. However, we call this land Diné People's Land, Dineta. And that clan name that I carry is from my mother. So as Diné people, we get our last names from our mothers, not from our fathers. However, we do have to acknowledge our other 3 grandparents. The first clan obviously is my mother's mother, that matrilineal line. But the other 3 grandparents is my father's mother, is the second that I acknowledge is Southern Cheyenne. Tsétsêhéstâhese is the proper name of the people, indigenous to all the way from Montana down to Colorado areas, Black Hills areas. My mother's father is the third clan that I honor, which is the Salt clan, Ashihe, of the Diné. And then my fourth clan is the Scottish, Bulagana, Dashanelle, my father's clan, my patrilineal clan, and Akut Ego, in that manner, I present myself and my clans. Very honored to be here. I'm very honored to speak on this topic. I've been speaking on this topic in various ways, and I just appreciate all of you showing up, so many of you, to receive this perspective that I have. And I think it's really important in general as non-Indigenous peoples, when we are learning from Indigenous cultures, to know how to learn properly. Because there's a lot of ways of learning that are not always intentionally bad, but are accidentally not honoring the people, or not even honoring the people, but just honoring the right way in general, no matter where you are in the world. Like if I was to go to, Italy, how it would be, like appropriate for me to behave as well. And so I want to give us a few of my ideas. Obviously, I can't speak for all Indigenous peoples, and I don't claim to, but I think I can offer some food for thought today and things for us to think about. So I'll just start with my story. I am a researcher who has looked into pre-colonial indigenous food systems and land management techniques. My doctoral research specifically was looking at the ways in which indigenous peoples shaped large regions of Turtle Island to benefit both humans and non-humans alike, really shattering the myth of the primitive Indian, shattering the myth of the hunter-gatherer Indian, and showing the world how we actually expertly curated and cultivated entire ecosystems for thousands of years on end. And I know you in Australia are not strangers to this. And I know probably not all of you are in Australia, but some of you are. And I think Australia is much more cognizant of the ways in which Aboriginal peoples really shaped the land through burning, through like their eel farms, their fish farms, so much incredible, what you could arguably call agriculture happened long before the Fertile Crescent theory of the start of agriculture. And that is racially charged. There's a reason why both Aboriginal peoples of Australia and Indigenous peoples of what we call America, why our heritage of agriculture was omitted from the history books and the popular consciousness. And that's particularly because the colonizers were very intently trying to paint us as primitive, as cultureless, as wasting the land. That was all to justify land seizure and in many cases attempted genocide. Because if they're not really people and they don't really have any culture or science, then you're not really killing a human, And it was a way to kind of do that cognitive dissonance, that mental gymnastics to help facilitate the process of land seizure and genocide, both knowingly and sometimes I think in a subconscious way as well. Just like some of us here, we don't, when we eat a pig or a cow or a chicken, we kind of tell ourselves like, oh, it's just a chicken. It doesn't really matter. It's just a cow. It's kind of how we mentally soothe ourselves to not fully be in touch with the fact that a living being has given its life for us to live, a living being that is equal to us. I think a lot of indigenous cultures do acknowledge that when we eat something, it's kind of a big deal. It's like if any one of us here would give our lives right now for one of us to live, eating an animal is treated with that same weight and that same gravity, that it's very special. And therefore we should eat every part of it, not waste it, etc. So just like we kind of soothe our minds into thinking like, oh, it's just an animal, I can throw it away. I can not eat, there's so many things we do with our animal relatives. So too do I think European people who became European colonizers, but used to be indigenous peoples in touch with their goddess cultures themselves before the trauma of Europe really was hitting for about 2,000 years straight. They really soothe their mind by how could you round up people and just massacre them? You kind of have to tell yourself these aren't really people, And also the notion of terra nullius, the notion of wasted land, really supported the notion that we as Europeans need to seize this land because we will put it to good use. That's a very common argument in a lot of the historical records. We will tame the land, we'll civilize the land, and we'll actually put it to use, whereas these poor primitive Indians aren't doing anything. When in fact we were, managing entire chestnut groves from Maine to Georgia. We were managing abalone fisheries in Santa Barbara Channel Islands for 12,000 years. We were building ancient 2,000-year-old clam gardens in the Pacific Northwest. We were burning the prairies with fire to make the land hospitable for bison and deer and other ungulates and herbivores. And we very, very truly gardened the entire continent of what we now call America, North America and South America. as an abundant food forest or food prairie or food desert or food coastal system. And we really created these extraordinary, and in many cases we still do, although of course it's been compromised greatly. That's sort of my journey, is to explain these things to people. But as I was doing this, I was going around, specifically the United States, as it were, although we prefer to call it Turtle Island, giving these speeches and showing people all the ways in which Native folks would like build these clam gardens, the ways in which, like in Australia, the Gunditjmara with their eel farms, and the ways of like Terra Preta managing soil systems in the Amazon River basin. And what I found was, as I was giving this knowledge to non-Native people, they sometimes thought that I was teaching them how to work the land. And I was, in some regards, but I don't think it was about them taking this knowledge and applying it to their own land holdings. It was about showing them how much we need to give land back to Indigenous peoples. And I didn't want people to simply take this knowledge, apply it to their own lands, and never really work to rectify the current situation, is that, which is that 98% of agricultural lands in the US, the USA, are owned by European Americans. So 98% are held by white people. And so I wasn't really saying like, here, take up all of our strategies, all of our knowledge and apply it to your land bases. I mean, I do think that's good. I do want people to know this information, but I was also showing them like, hey, this is what we did here. This is our heritage. And we need you to give this land back, you know what I'm saying? But I think the two can be done concurrently. I think the two can be done as in, for every acre you apply this Indigenous knowledge to, you know, work to return another acre to Indigenous people, you know? I think that we have the potential to be allies to Indigenous peoples in a way that doesn't just benefit us, but benefits them. And I think we have a way to learn from Indigenous knowledge systems in a way that actively stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities, rather than simply taking the info and running with it. And so I also realized that I was accidentally sharing all this information without properly training people on how to receive it. And I think ultimately I would do it again, because I was trying my best, and I'm really grateful that this knowledge is getting out there, and a lot more people know now that my people, Indigenous peoples of the US, were quite active managers of Indigenous landscapes, and in some cases still are. That's the big thing I want to talk about today, is how do we not be extractive in our learning process? How do we give back? And I'll just share a series of stories, really. I think that might be the way to teach today. So like I said, I was giving these speeches and people were so excited to take it home with them. And I think that's good. And then other times I would give these speeches, and when I would get done with my speeches, I would get kind of rushed with people. And I don't know, they would want to tell me about that one time they went to the Navajo reservation, or that one Native elder that they know, or they would want, one woman, she was saying, if I practice these practices, I think I can become Indigenous to Turtle Island. And I was like, well, I don't think that's really what we're going for, you know? But the first two of, like, you know, telling me the time they'd been to the Navajo reservation, or telling me that the one Native person that they knew, that's very forgivable. I'm not trying to downplay it too much, or put it down. It's just when they speak to me, it's more for them than to actually communicate with me. It's almost like they're almost like they're talking to themselves. Like, I'm exhausted. I given this big speech. I usually travel to a city to give the speech, and if I were to stand after every speech there, I would get like a lot of people coming up to me, talking to me, which are really opportunities to talk to themselves. So like I'm kind of like a sounding board, which is fine, but I have limited energy sometimes, and it's slightly I don't feel like a human completely at that moment. I think a different way to talk is like, you know, telling me, sharing with me things, but also saying like, how are you doing? How did that go for you? And sort of that reciprocity of communication rather than talking at me. But I don't judge any of these people whatsoever. I know it's hard to know what to do sometimes. um, and many don't even really care what they say. They just want to talk to me for a second, and just so that they can say they did, which is also a slightly I don't want to say dehumanizing because it's not quite that bad, but it's somewhere towards that direction. Um, so yeah, just really honoring Indigenous messengers and knowledge keepers as human beings too, and thinking about how they're doing. How are you doing? Or like, yeah, I went to an event one time and we arrived. We didn't eat all day, but it was time to go on stage, right? And we just wanted to do a prayer. We just wanted to do a prayer before we went on stage, and the person was like, we really need to stay on task. Like, we need you to get up on stage. And that's also kind of like not caring about the messenger, right? You just care about the message and what you can get out of it for your event, etc. And I'm giving you some extreme examples, and I'm not trying to complain or anything too much. I'm just trying to share some examples in hopes that it might. I think stories sometimes teach us better than a list of do's and do nots. Just so you can probably imagine me in these situations, and other maybe Aboriginal elders who are called on a lot to give speeches or to honor the land. And so yeah, so he was rushing us to get on stage, and we just wanted to do a prayer beforehand. And that's another example of sort of extractivist learning, where it's like, we don't really care if you haven't eaten. We don't really care if in your culture you need to do a prayer first. We just need you to go on time, so that our show, and it was like a show, it wasn't quite like a learning activity like this is. It was more of like a performance or something. And I think that happens a lot, like music festivals too. A lot of Indigenous peoples are placed there almost like installments or placeholders, or almost like an adornment, like kind of like you wear like some earrings or something, kind of like put some native people there, almost like a backdrop or something, and not really like asking them, how can this festival serve you? How can we be of service to you, instead of how can you be of service to this festival idea? um Actually, in fact, the one time I went to Australia, I made the mistake of going to a festival. Really intense in terms of the extractivist culture there. But I loved Australia, and I loved the people, and I loved the way that I learned so much. It's just the festival itself they hadn't been trained properly on how to collaborate really with Indigenous peoples rather than integrate. So yeah, those are some examples. So yeah, sometimes they'll tell me the story of the one Native person they know, or and I probably would make the same mistake if I was them, because sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. But then there's the deepest extractivist learnings, which come from, I would say, more of a capitalistic mindset, which I don't think many people in here are in danger of doing, but I'll just share it anyways, just to cover the bases. I mean, let's consider like the acai berry, which is a berry from South America that was cultivated by indigenous peoples. Um, that was sort of became this really hot commodity and still is a superfood. So Western European culture learned about this berry and decided to turn it into a cash crop for themselves, essentially, which had all kinds of damaging effects on the acai berry ecosystem. There's really no concern, right? And after I wax on here about what not to do, I want to take some time about what to do as well. So I don't want to just focus on the negative for too long, but I'll just say a few more. Um, when the colonists came to um, our lands, they also were coming out of 2,000 years of open warfare in Europe, where we're talking torture chambers, we're talking public disembowelments, we're talking all manner of monarchies and hierarchies and serfdoms, institutionalized rape of women, as we saw in the British Empire. Really, really challenging stuff. And probably the most challenging was the persecution of women as witches, where we have, you know, millions of women suffering from this. Some even burned alive, some drowned alive. Um, Almost all of them outcasted and abused in some form or another, just for having a birthmark on your arm in the wrong place, or not having children fast enough after marriage. All these things were reason for suspicion of being a witch. So it was just a really hard time in Europe, and not to mention the warfare, just constant warfare, which also had its twin, or maybe not twin, but its brother at least, is a famine. And so I really think this extractivist mindset, you have to have a little bit of understanding and compassion for where it came from, because when you're living in a dog eat dog environment for 2,000 years and you don't have access to food always, or safety, you kind of just have to stockpile stuff and hoard stuff and get it while you can. And if you come upon something valuable, capitalize on it and take advantage of it. And to be an entrepreneur, right? Which entrepreneur is made of two French words, entre and prendre. Entre meaning between, and prendre meaning to take. So the entrepreneur was the taker, the preneur, to take, to capture, to acquire. And that normalization of entrepreneurialism, which at its core, I don't think is really proper human behavior in general, to be a taker. So that when the colonizers first were coming here in larger numbers, I think that grab and go and murder and conquer thing, again, is coming out of a very, like they call it, the dark ages. The dark ages. It was very dark. It was a dark time. Oh, not to mention a third of Europe dying overnight in the bubonic plague. Yeah, crazy stuff going on. So from that trauma, I think we as Europeans, I speak we because I am part European, we developed a sort of extractivist culture. Obviously, that's pretty obvious to say. And so at that point, we apply that to everything accidentally sometimes, including even the things we hold sacred, such as Indigenous knowledge. So I think a really good example is these, I won't name them specifically out of respect, but these online communities that commodify Indigenous knowledge, and kind of predate on insecure people who want to be a shaman or want to study shamanism. And really, us as Native people, we never even use the word shaman. We never consider ourselves shaman. And one of the things that's very common in our communities is, if you are a healer, you would never call yourself a healer. People who proclaim to be healers are usually kind of suspicious to some extent. And so I think that commodification of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous spirituality is actually quite a big industry, unfortunately, including the commodification of songs, plant medicines, experiences. And of course, we're working with populations that have been dispossessed and disenfranchised for hundreds of years. And so, yeah, there might be some Native people who will basically stand as a placeholder for this commodification because maybe they don't have much of a choice, or maybe it's the first time they've really felt honored. So we also have this power differential of the Western Europe coming to Native people for knowledge, but because we haven't been asked to give our knowledge for 500 years, it's so exciting. And because we don't always have economic power, you can wave some money in front of someone and they'll be excited to kind of just play along with however you want it to go. And so that's another pitfall we can fall into, which is kind of, I don't want to say co-opting people, but kind of taking Indigenous elders, Indigenous knowledge holders, and kind of pedestalizing them or placing them in places where, yes, they may benefit, but we often capitalize on it as well. And so I think, especially in the realm of spiritual knowledge, it depends on which community you're talking to, but there are many, many Indigenous communities that kind of would rather not commodify sacred knowledge and see it as a sort of a slippery slope. And so, yeah, that's obviously a big one, is the online shamanism courses and this and that. I think it's great to teach spiritual things. I just think it should be done in the absence of profiteering. And I think it's great to do spiritual things, but I think it's good to do sometimes in face-to-face, person-to-person, oral history, oral teachings versus, different venues we find it in. So again, sorry if this is coming off as judgmental, or I'm just trying to give a few examples that, like I said, food for thought. I definitely don't mean to be judgmental. And I actually, even though I'm kind of poo-pooing these things, I actually have a lot of space in my heart for understanding and compassion of how people can end up in these positions. And I think if my elders hadn't kind of guided me and put me on some different paths, I very easily could have been engaging in these things. So I don't want to judge people at all. Just hard to know what to do when you don't know. And so, yeah, these are just different forms of commodifications and extractivist learning. So now let's go into what do we do? What's a positive way to be a part of this? And I think some of the things I wrote down are solidarity learning, learning with the intention to be in solidarity. So what does that look like? Well, I think acting local is really important. Whoever you're working with, or rather wherever you're working, to make sure to be in deep relationship with the local Indigenous peoples, and contribute in tangible terms to their visions. And each Indigenous community is going to have different visions for themselves. So there's no one size fits all of yes, do this for every community. It's more like asking, what do you need? What are you trying to see in this world? What are you trying to create? And following that lead, following that prerogative, following that articulation of their vision and what they're trying to create. So, for example, I think one good story I could share is that I did a big event in Whidbey Island in Washington. And I gave my little spiel about Indigenous, knowledge, rather Indigenous land management, Indigenous ecosystems design. And it went great. But what was really cool is that we set it up to really benefit the local nation. So even though I'm not from there, I said, hey, can we contact the local people? So in this case, there are a few, but we worked with the Snohomish people. And yeah, they were, for one thing, there was a relative from that community who opened up the whole thing, but didn't just open up the whole thing, but like all the book sales went straight to them. And they were consulted to say, how could we turn this event into something that benefits you? And in this case, she was working on the National Boarding School Healing Coalition in the United States, which is basically working on raising awareness and doing studies of the ways in which boarding schools, I think in Australia they call it the stolen generation, Aboriginal people who were taken from their families, educated, adopted out, all kinds of terrible things. Similarly, in the US, there were hundreds and hundreds of these boarding schools, almost every one of them having also like graveyards next to them of children who would pass. And people think it was all in Canada, but it was actually worse here. We just don't talk about it. So it was a really cool event because not only did we get to include and integrate the Snohomish peoples, but we also consulted and said, how can this event be of service to actually moving the needle for your visions of what you're trying to create? And so that's just an example of like solidarity learning, which to me I define as learning. The very process of learning contributes to the visions of the local people. So solidarity learning, again, the very process of learning is designed to contribute to the visions of the people you're learning from. So, for example, let's say you want to learn how to weave from Diné people who are expert weavers and shepherds. You might say, hey, when we do this workshop, is there anything our community can contribute to you? And they might say, well, yeah, like, do you want to buy some hay for the sheep? Do you want to support us by making a connection with this group that we really need a connection with? Do you want to provide a space where we can do our own event for our own purposes? So basically you just hear them out and see what's going on and see how you can be a part of it. It's a very fun adventure, actually. It's not like a burden or like, oh, I have to do this thing. It's like, oh, cool. I now am what they call making relatives. I'm creating relationships with people that will be lifelong, that I can actually be a part of, having more family in the world, more kinship, and that our connection is one of positivity and one of rewriting the story from one of colonial extractivism to reciprocal kinship. And I think that is really exciting. Actually, it's like an adventure of like, cool, we get to be the generation that doesn't do the status quo, like it's to shake it up a little bit and not do business as usual. To me, is very exciting. So that's solidarity learning. Another thing that's related, but slightly different, is service learning. The service learning is where you actually perform some kind of community service. And through that service, you learn. That one's kind of fun because sometimes you don't really have a learning outcome per se. You don't have like, oh, I want to learn X, Y, Z. Actually, what has primacy is that I want to be of service. And I trust that in the process of being of service, I will organically, by osmosis, learn some really interesting things that maybe not I nor the people I'm serving could ever foresee, because it might just happen in the moment. And so a good example of that is, we're building a hogan at my house. Well, we just finished. What if people came and built the hogan and basically like just trusted that in that process, something fun would happen, some learning would happen. And that's kind of I think maybe the most extreme on the other side of the spectrum. There's like super extractivist capitalistic learning, and then there's like maybe service learning is the other, because you're really not there to learn anything in particular. You're kind of just enjoying the process of being of service, and trusting that the lessons you are there to learn will naturally come about. And I'm a big proponent of settler societies being in service to the local community, indigenous communities that they're in coexistence with. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, if you are not indigenous to that area, which is myself included oftentimes, because I'm not always in New Mexico where my people are from. Maybe I'm in California, maybe I'm in New Jersey, or, maybe I'm in going to Denmark. Actually, this is maybe a good story. I went to Denmark a couple years ago, and they're like, Lyla, you're the Native American spiritual lady, right? So why don't you lead us in a prayer to this ancient rock site? Like, how in Europe there's all these ancient rock circles, and they're so beautiful and so fascinating, and like just really old, like tens of thousands of years old sometimes. And I'm like, okay, I could try that. But then as we're approaching the rock circle, I'm like, what am I doing? This is not my land. So I said, is there any Danish people here? And like two of them like raised their hand. I'm like, okay, like I think you guys just go and we'll just follow you, So like it's not really and they did. They led it beautifully. And even though they might not have been 150% in touch with the ancestral culture there, because maybe it had been compromised, thousands of years ago, they still intuitively had some basic ideas of how to approach that circle and how to be in relationship with it. And yeah, it was really quite fun, and very powerful. I mean, we probably could have sat there for days. It was just such a palpable healing energy to that place. So yeah, I think honoring the local peoples wherever we stand is incredibly important for generating harmony in all our global community. And I think that, the opposite of extractivist learning is contributing learning where we're somehow contributing to the community we're learning from. And I think this is important because we actually need to learn from indigenous peoples. I'm not saying we shouldn't learn from it. Like, I actually agree with what most of the world is saying, which is we sorely, urgently, immediately need to learn from indigenous peoples, and cultures and communities and sciences. So like, yes. And that's why trainings like these are all the more important, because we don't have time anymore. We have to learn this stuff like now, it would have been better 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but hey, it's never too late to do the right thing. And so in that sense, I think trainings like these are of the utmost importance, because just as urgently as we need to learn indigenous knowledge, we concurrently urgently need to learn how to learn indigenous knowledge properly in a way that is not accidentally going to recreate the same structures of power differentials and abuses and extraction that we're trying to get away from. I'll give one more example, and then we can go into Q&A. Essentially, the carbon offset market is becoming another example of extractivist learning. We know from a recent UN report that 5% of the global population is indigenous as they define indigenous peoples, but those 5% are overseeing 80% of global biodiversity. So we have 5% of human population overseeing 80% of global biodiversity through their expert land care systems, land management systems. And so the sort of the climate group, the climate crisis mitigation people, the polycrisis, supporting biodiversity and social systems and hydrological systems all at once, nature-based solutions, they're all wanting to learn from Indigenous knowledge because we're quite good at doing this ecological thing. Um, but there's these other hawks in the wings that are like, so this is the Shell Corporation's nature-based solutions website, where we are investing to protect and enhance natural ecosystems that capture CO2 emissions, benefit local communities, and improve biodiversity. We use the carbon credits these projects generate to help customers decarbonize by compensating for their emissions, and then they have all these like indigenous, projects, carbon farming in Australia, regenerating mangroves, and it sounds very nice and stuff, but it's essentially mobilizing indigenous communities to create these carbon capturing ecosystems so that the rest of us can keep extracting oil and burning it to offset our emissions. And just in general, the offset market is extremely greenwashed and sort of problematic in that it's not only commodifying nature, but by extension, it's commodifying indigenous knowledge. And so the offset market, I think, even though they're like, oh, this is the only way to solve climate change in time because it's harnessing market mechanisms and blah, 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 it's kind of just recreating the same problem. And so I think that, again, I'll just end by saying before we go to questions, that though my personal opinion, my personal perspective is that in order to engage with Indigenous knowledge properly, we need to come very humbly, very in the spirit of giving rather than taking, very in the spirit of learning how the community wants us to honor this knowledge, because each community will be a little different. In other words, not what do you want me to learn, but what do you want me to do with this knowledge once I receive it, is a really good question to ask. How do I hold this knowledge is a great question to ask. And in the process of learning, being in solidarity with that community, showing up to their events, showing up to what they have going on. Maybe they're trying to buy some land back. That's a big thing right now. Like making sure you're at the fundraiser, making sure you're getting your networks plugged into the fundraiser, contributing and being of service to their visions. So with that, I think you get my point, and I will stop talking.
Thank you, Lyla. Everything that you've said about is about being in this right relationship, and that is this right relationship within ourselves, in our communities, in our place, between communities. And so from your work in Indigenous food systems, considering that this global community here has been invited through the permaculture network, where do you see as sort of like a really easy starting point perhaps for a conversation? I mean, there's many things that you suggested there, but I wonder whether there's anything particularly from a permacultural perspective that you might have reflections on.
Yes, in fact, that's something I meant to speak on. How does the permaculture community be in right relationship with Indigenous knowledge? For one thing, right? I think, for one thing, I think a lot of it is about where we practice permaculture and how we are sensitive to and accountable to the history of that land. So, in other words, you could have the greatest permaculturalist skills ever and just cultivate abundance in extraordinary ways. But let's say you're doing it on land where Native peoples were massacred out of the area, which is pretty much everywhere, right? Sorry, it's not funny, but it's just crazy how true that is. And so, like, how do you create abundance while still being sensitive to the history of the land? I think that's something that we forget, is that it's not just about regenerating soil, it's about regenerating relationships. It's not just about healing water tables, it's about healing intercultural communities. And it's not just about creating abundance for more food, but creating abundance in our hearts with each other to where we feel good around each other. And so I think that's the biggest thing I could say as permaculturalists is, how do you be sensitive to the land you're permaculturing on? And one of the ways you can do that, like I said, is sort of think of it as like, okay, for every acre that I do this permaculture pilot project, I want to make sure I'm also working on, an acre of the Aboriginal folks' lands and the missions that they're engaging in. And I think the starting point, if you want to engage with communities, is a very simple question that I teach people often, which is, how can I help, if at all? That is the magical question, the magical solidarity question, right? How can I help, if at all? And you put them in the driver's seat of how you are in solidarity with them. And again, we're operating in contexts where I'm assuming a lot of us here, this is perhaps a very terrible assumption, but I can't see everyone. But I'm just making the very risky assumption that many of us on this call are of settler society. And so if we are of settler society, part of the context we're working in is very charged, very painful, a lot of touchy places, right? Where like you just kind of go close to it and it hurts for a lot of Native communities. So it's a very different situation than if you're simply an English person doing permaculture in England. That too has some touchy stuff with like the Scottish and the Irish and the Welsh and how they were subjugated and just terrible things, and their language is prohibited. So I don't know if there's anywhere where this isn't a thing, but I would imagine there are some places where you don't really have to consider all this stuff. But I think Australia and the United States in particular being sites where this is kind of omnipresent, it's kind of just part of our exciting adventure that we get to be a part of, writing a beautiful ending to a not so beautiful historical chapter and writing a beautiful new chapter where we are in really good relationship. And part of that touchy environment, part of that wounded space, is that Indigenous peoples never had agency in how they were helped, right? It was like, oh, you need Christianity, let me help you, here's a Bible. Oh, you need civilization, let me help you, here's some wheat. Oh, you need education, here's a scholarship to a university. Like, we have these preconceived notions of how other people need our help. So when you say, how can I help, if at all, you're already healing something. You're already going against the grain of this world where we never even had a choice over how we were helped, right? And so when you say, how can I help, if at all, you're supporting agency, and you're sitting in the back seat and putting them in the driver's seat, which is really what we're kind of asking for in general as Indigenous peoples, I think, is like, let us lead in our own land, please. This is our home. We haven't been able to lead here for a long time. Like, trust us. We won't lead you astray. Like, we're gonna do a good job, And so I think when we say, how can I help, if at all, that's a good conversation starter, because you're also not assuming they want your help.
I think that if at all is like a critical part of that, isn't it? And also, I think when I like here in Australia anyway, and particularly in urban environments where most people live, one of the biggest problems is people just don't know even who to ask. So from a perspective of where to find the right people to ask is something that I hear quite often, like, what, because, in teaching permaculture designers and educators, and, a big part of it saying, this, go and find a connect with the local communities and saying, yeah, but there's no one here. So how do you respond in that situation, and how do we sort of pull back the layers so that people can see what's actually really there and find the ways to connect when there's such a separation that exists today?
I don't know exactly, frankly, for the Australian context very well. I'll just be honest about that. But I will say here in what we now call the United States, that's a big thing that people say is like, oh, we would consult the natives, but I don't know where they are. I don't know if they exist. And 95% of the time, the answer is they're actually right down the road. And the myth of the extinct indigenous culture is a very harmful myth because it kind of makes us believe there's no one left to consult, there's no one left to talk to. And I think it's more it's usually not true with the American context. Like, for instance, Virginia. People think of Virginia, they don't think really of indigenous peoples because it's such a very heavily colonized state. This is on the eastern coast, right, where they were hit first. They were hit like right away. But there are 12 federally and or state recognized tribes in Virginia, right? But no one knows anything about them because they've been systematically shut out of the popular discourse. So sometimes you have to do a little digging. Sometimes you have to do a little research, exploration. Now, let's say you really are in a place where potentially, as far as anybody knows, the local indigenous peoples are just gone. Um, you could still talk to the neighboring nations and learn from them, and say, hey, our understanding is this community is not here anymore. Is that your understanding? And if so, how would you suggest we kind of honor this land? But let's say there is a native community there. My personal experience is to always ask the women, of the nation. I don't know how it is in Australia, but I know that in the United States, the tribal governments are very often puppet governments installed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and or the Indian Reorganization Act. And so like they don't always represent the people very well. And so if you really want to get to the grassroots, get to where the people are actually living, you often talk to the women who are working in the trenches day in and day out and ask them, how can I help, if at all? And there's all kinds of interesting research about women's leadership being really, a leverage point of like change and in terms of micro lending and even mitigating the climate crisis. Paul Hawkins said the biggest thing we can do is support women. So anyways, that's who I would ask first. I think the biggest catalyst to that collaboration was the curiosity, the desire, and the willingness of the non-native organizers to do the work to build those relationships. It required a little extra work, right? You had to email the lady and say, hey, do you want to come to this event? Hey, how should we do it? Hey, do you want to uplift your nonprofit? How can we be, it takes a little extra work than just booking the venue, booking the speaker, making a flyer, which is already a lot of work, right? And so a lot of times people don't want to go that extra mile. But I think that was the real magical ingredient, was that desire and that willingness to create that, those relationships, that relationship building process. Sometimes it takes driving an hour away, meeting with someone face to face. Sometimes it takes making that phone call, doing that cold call, doing that cold email, and just reaching out and going out on a limb. And sometimes it takes extra time, so you might also want to factor in an extra month, or two to your planning process. There's a great article on, researching with indigenous peoples. And the title of the article is, I spent the first 2 years drinking tea. It might take you 2 years of drinking tea with people to finally get to a point where you're ready to like So it's a long time. It's a longer time that a lot of like consumerist capitalists, they don't got time to make relationships. And I think that's the most revolutionary thing we can do is to cultivate those relationships.
Thank you so much, Lyla, for being here and sharing with the audience that's here now, but also with everyone who'll be listening to this later.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you all listening, and it means a lot. So I hope you'll have a great conference. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World from the International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. Check out the show notes below to find a link to Lyla June's website and to where you can find all the conversations at the International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. And also check the show notes for where you can find details of our permaculture courses and resources. Make sure you're signed up to hear news and updates, and come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired, one planet way of life.